1, 2, check, check, 1, 2. Stream starting in 2 minutes. Thank you. Streaming starting in 2 minutes. Thank you. Cling, clong.
Good evening. My name is Ted Giannoulis, and on behalf of all of us at the Explorers Club, welcome. This is a special evening tonight. We're really excited about it for a number of reasons, which I'll mention. But I'm just curious. We often ask who's here for the first time. I just have a feeling that a bunch of people tonight are here, let's say for the first or second time. How many? So we love to see that. And by the way, that's a testament to Amanda, our speaker, that people would come in. The reason we're excited about it can really be found in the title of Amanda's amazing book, which I hope you'll all get. And the key phrase there is a new history. And when people look at the Explorers Club, which I'll tell you just one sentence about because we want to get to the main show here, but people often think about it being a historical thing. And that's true. But there's also looking at our present, examining our past, and then looking to the future. So there are many, many time-based elements to it. So nights like tonight really stretch our mind. In fact, what I usually do is, if people haven't been here before, I start by saying something like, when you come into the Harry Potterish building, you see this plaque up there with the 5 famous firsts. And my evolution on the 5 famous firsts was, for years and years, I would say, and it's the North Pole and the South Pole and the bottom of the ocean and the moon and a little place on the bottom for Mars because of some of our members. So that's all great and exciting and interesting. But the deeper I went on these things over time, I started to say that the 5 famous firsts up there were really all team sports. It wasn't about one person. One person often was the signature name, and you'll hear an example or two tonight. But it also expanded to a much broader concept of a team that helped something happen, whether it was Apollo or the North Pole or the bottom of the ocean. But then over the last couple of years, it's evolved further to realize that not only is it a team sport, but it's a very diverse and inclusive team sport. If you look at examples like Hidden Figures, if you have looked at the space program, you're going to hear an amazing example tonight, so I won't go into it because I won't want to take away from Amanda's presentation, but the North Pole has an incredible example of this. So there's an incredible revaluation and celebration going on of previous efforts and initiatives of a broad range of people to make these things happen. And I think that's a really healthy thing. For the Explorers Club and for the community in general. And I'd also, just a quick shout out to J.R. Harris, who's here in the audience, who has starting a function on our site, actually, but also a society, the Society of Forgotten Explorers. So you might want to grab him later. It ties back into Amanda's story, which is so amazing that happened. So we met Amanda Bellows, historian and author, 2 ways, actually. I managed to bump into her through a set of family friends, heard what she was doing and saying, oh my gosh, you have to come to the Explorers Club. Turns out she'd already been to the Explorers Club because during COVID, when she was researching her book, she reached out to Lacey, who is our incredible archivist and historian and all these other things combined, to start talking through some of the Explorers Club stories and work on this important new book. So we were thrilled that it's from those sort of humble roots it grew into the idea of, well, when this book comes out, why don't we bring it into the Explorers Club and share it with all of you. So for the reasons I mentioned, we're really excited about it. I love the fact that it's new history, that it's really going deeper and broader and bringing more meaning to those, but also sets the stage for a future exploration because we really want it to be about the future in terms of where the Explorers Club is going. So one sentence on the Explorers Club. Having said that, it was founded a long, long time ago in 1904, originally by people exploring the white spaces, North Pole, South Pole. That's why you have a bunch of the famous firsts have to do with that. But over time, other people joined. So Sir Edmund Hillary was our honorary chair. John Glenn was our honorary chair. We've had many, many people from many disciplines, and today we're over 4,000 members. This is our only physical headquarters at this point in time. Maybe that will change in the future. But we're 4,000 members all over the world. Only 700 or 800 are really in this area, and they do everything. They go into space, they go to the oceans, mountains, deserts, jungles, valleys, you name it, people go there. And the one thing that binds everybody together, which is why the people with the hand raises tonight actually here, is a shared sense of curiosity. And curiosity not for its own sake, but also when you learn and explore and do something to bring it back and do something with it. So we have expeditions that go all over the world. These are flags from some of our more notable expeditions. This is the Kontiki flag. When they do something really cool, we retire them so they don't get lost, stolen, or broken. my favorite thing in the whole club is right behind here, we actually have a flag that went on Apollo 13. All the lunar landings carried Explorers Club flags. They're usually this big. For some reason, Apollo 13 decided to carry a big one. And it's in its original baggie with a little note from James Lovell saying, sorry I didn't get a chance to unwrap this. We had a little stuff going on. I feel bad about it. And he actually sat in a chair right here a couple of years ago and thought that was hysterical that flag is like still up there. But that's the spirit of exploration. The flags are a symbol of that because you have 200 of them. They go all around the world. They develop this history. And that's back to the idea of respect for the past, excitement about the present, but definitely an eye towards the future. We do all kinds of programs. Be happy to tell you about them. But for tonight, we want to move on to Amanda's presentation. So if you do have questions, if Explorers Club members, please raise your hand if you're a member of the Explorers Club. So feel free to look up any of those folks or me. We give tours. We love to tell you about the programs we do. With that, we're going to move on to tonight's program. So as I mentioned, Amanda is an accomplished historian. She also teaches here at the New School in that subject and has published her dissertation that she may or may not touch on tonight. I don't know. You have a lot to cover. Probably not. But has now done this remarkable book. She's been, the list of places she's been published are the ones that would thrill you. It's the Wall Street Journal, it's the Smithsonian, the New York Times, all those sorts of titles. She's extremely well respected, and now she's on a book tour where she's been to 15 places recently, including the Library of Congress, which I hope she tells us about. But she's a pleasure to deal with. She's got incredible insights. The way she curated this book and the topics she selected and the depth and perception she brought to it is exceptional. So I think we're in for a really special evening. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. I'm really looking forward to a great conversation about exploration and the adventurers in this book. But I wanted to start by asking you all a question, which is, why do you think that some explorers from the past have been forgotten while others have been remembered? So maybe male explorers have historically been more frequently remembered. Okay, so racism, we have a long history of that in our country, and that has been definitely a factor with who's been written out of the narrative. Someone said good PR. Yeah, some of them wrote themselves in the narrative. Great, so which people, and we'll talk about some tonight, right, who recorded their own stories and how did they share them with the world? That's definitely, I think, a big factor as well. Newspaper backing, right? That's a big story for the Peary-Henson expedition. Different newspapers backing different explorers on the race to the North Pole. Wealth, definitely a big factor, then and now in terms of what expeditions get funded, stories told, etc. Imperialism. Okay, imperialism. Being the first or claiming to be the first, who kind of, right, again, I'm thinking about the North Pole, but races to places, great.
Tragic failure.
Tragic failure, right, and if you don't survive, right, then your story may not get told.
Something that's really out there for general people, or a small area that is much more particular.
Great, so where are you exploring, how accessible is it to other people, etc. Well, this is a great place to start, and maybe we can keep some of these ideas in mind as we go through 4 really compelling people from history. So today I wanted to highlight 4 forgotten explorers from my new book, the title you can see here. But first I wanted to go back to the mid-19th century. So in 1861, the German immigrant Emanuel Leutze completed this painting, and he featured the 2 fellows that you see on the bottom of the slide here as 2 of the nation's foremost explorers. Any guesses who those men are? One of them is Clark. That's William Clark on the far side.
Kit Carson.
Good guess. Close with Kit Carson. Neither of those are right. Not Davy Crockett. Yes, it's Daniel Boone. Great. And so, so you can look at the time period, right? This is kind of the quintessential manifest destiny type painting, and this is who people thought of, right, in this period as the foremost American explorers. And before writing this book, if someone had asked me, who America's most prominent explorers were, I'm sure I would have thought of Clark and Boone. I might have added Davy Crockett, Kit Carson. I bet, being explorers yourselves, many of you, that your lists would have been a lot longer than mine. But nonetheless, I think today that many Americans continue to kind of think of men exploring, especially white men exploring the western frontier in the mid-19th century, kind of as being one of the sweet spots for American exploration. So when I began researching this book, I wondered who else shared their drive to discover the unknown across the last 200 years. And as I began researching, I came across the stories of courageous men and women from diverse backgrounds, many of whom have been forgotten over time. And I learned more about why their names have been left out of history for so long. Yes, so my book tells the story of 10 adventurers, 4 men and 6 women, whose discoveries shaped the course of U.S. history. And each person's story in the book also represents a broader period. The book begins with the Corps of Discovery's journey across the continent to the Pacific Ocean during the early American Republic era. Only that story is really told from the perspective of Sacagawea, seen here. It moves through the gold rush, the homesteading era, the birth of the conservation movement, the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, the Age of Imperialism, 2 world wars, and the space race, and it ends with Sally Ride's story on the Space Shuttle Challenger. The first half of the book looks at 5 explorers operating within the bounds of the continental U.S., and the second part looks at 5 explorers who move outside of the United States. So looking at the Belgian Congo, South America, the Arctic, and then looking at air and space as frontiers as well. So the book, you learn about these 10 explorers, and you also get a big survey of U.S. history through the lens of exploration. So to begin researching the explorers, I took a road trip in the footsteps of the Corps of Discovery, traveling from St. Louis, Missouri to Astoria, Oregon. This was in 2021. I then went south to California, traveled to Nevada, and visited other sites relating to other American explorers, not just the Corps of Discovery. So I had it was a blessing to be able to see some of the beautiful parts of our country. So I just included a few slides here. This is a wonderful site with a lot of importance to indigenous communities in South Dakota. I heard it was like Teddy Bear Day, National Teddy Bear Day, so in honor of Theodore Roosevelt. This is a really neat spot. I don't know if is anyone here like a fan of the Corps of Discovery's journey or knows it well? Okay, well this, in the middle of the journey, there's this amazing moment where Sacagawea and the Corps of Discovery meet with the Shoshones, from whom she'd been kidnapped and separated. They're trying to bargain with Shoshones for horses to continue the journey, and so this is the meeting place we know of where they met. Why is it all wet? Because it's now like underwater, it was flooded, but so imagine it without water, and that is what that site would have looked like. Here, has anyone here been to Lemhi Pass? Okay. That's my mom in the front, and she was there with me. Yeah, she took this photo actually. Yeah, so Lemhi Pass is situated in the Beaverhead Mountains of the Bitterroot Range, and it spans about 2 miles across the boundary between Montana and Idaho. So Native Americans used this pass as a route across the Rockies and the Continental Divide for thousands of years before the Corps of Discovery passed through here in 1805. And this is a special picture to me because I reached my 50th state here at this boundary between Montana and Idaho. Anyway, back to the real explorers. So I wanted to start by talking to you about a man named James Beckwourth, known as Jim during his lifetime. Has anyone heard of or read anything about Jim Beckwourth before? Great. 1 or 2, 3. Great. Okay, good. So this will hopefully be new to many of you. So Jim Beckwourth was a mountain man from the early 19th century. He was born into slavery in Frederick County, Virginia, to a white landowner and an enslaved woman. So he was legally, under the law, considered to be a slave, but he was raised by his father. His father moved their family to St. Louis, Missouri in 1810. And St. Louis, as you probably know, was then the gateway to the western frontier. So during Beckwourth's lifetime, he ends up living among lots of different groups of people, including brigades of mountain men and indigenous people, specifically the members of the Crow Nation. So how does he get to be a mountain man? So he grows up in St. Louis, and he's introduced, he gets a little bit of formal schooling, but he sees the burgeoning fur trade happening all around him. And that's around the time his father legally emancipated him from slavery. It was a time when global demand for pelts, particularly these top hats made from beaver skins, were very popular in fueling the fur trade. So that fuels a rush among suppliers like John Jacob Astor, the Chouteau family, and the trader Manuel Lisa. Can I just ask, how's the sound? Is it too loud or it's okay? Thank you. Just let me know. So as a young man, Beckwourth really wanted to travel to the western interior of the continent because he hoped to make a fortune. In his autobiography, he said the following about why he went off. Being possessed with a strong desire to see the celebrated Rocky Mountains and the great western wilderness so much talked about, I engaged in General William Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Company. So that's kind of his entree into leaving St. Louis and then, going off to become a mountain man. He starts by working as a fur trader. I wanted to pause and ask you a question, as we're thinking about what motivates people to go off and become explorers. And the question is, how do you think that Beckwourth's experience, being born into slavery in Virginia and being, legally considered to be a slave throughout his early life, how might that experience have led him to pursue a career on the so-called western frontier? So someone said freedom, maybe a desire for more freedom, and how might we define freedom? If he's legally free in St. Louis.
But it was a wide open society.
Great. So I think that's a really important point. Society is there, right? She said it was a wide open society on the frontier. And I think things, of course, are not perfect in the sense of race relations, but it's a diverse place being in the West, people from all over, different indigenous tribes, different settlers, and you don't have the same kind of black-white binary that is defining relations in antebellum Virginia, for instance. What were you going to say? Any other ideas about why being born into slavery might have led him to the frontier?
A lot of times people avoid exploration because they're stuck to a comfort or a safety within their existing lifestyle.
Yeah.
And if you were born into slavery, you're not really bound by that. You're going to be open to whatever the world has to offer.
Great. Open. So, he's more open, and that's true. He was more open to what the world had to offer. He didn't have as much, he didn't own property. He didn't have a really stable lifestyle at home back in St. Louis, and so he felt this desire to go off and see what was out there, and he was extremely entrepreneurial. He also had a knack for being in exactly the right spot in the country when something exciting was happening. I'll tell you about how he's in California right when the gold rush begins. So during the next 15 years, he goes off, and he travels all throughout the Rocky Mountains with trading on behalf of the American Fur Company. And he lives among Crow people. He has 7 indigenous wives. He ends up leaving them all, going to the Southwest, marrying someone there, leaving her behind, going to, these are complicated figures, many of them. Many explorers are, I think. But he ends up in California right at the start of the gold rush. This is a neat painting. So it's May of 1849. Thousands of people are flocking to California. Beckwourth just happens to be there. And he hops on a boat from Monterey to San Francisco. I think it's like one of the first boats that arrive coming from New York. And he just gets on that boat, gets off in San Francisco, and goes right up to the motherlode country. But there he takes this entrepreneurial approach of selling goods to miners at inflated prices instead of prospecting for gold right away, although he later does that too. So in 1850, Beckwourth heads to California's American Valley, and that's where he starts prospecting for gold. So he's with a group of other people, and they're looking for gold. However, he doesn't find gold. What he finds is a hidden path through a treacherous mountain range, and here's what he said about it. We struck across this beautiful valley to the waters of the Yuba, from thence to the waters of the Truckee, which latter flowed in an easterly direction, telling us we were on the eastern slope of the mountain range. This passage, he predicted, would afford the best wagon road into the American Valley approaching from the eastward. So that's a route that would increase immigration and then increase prosperity to the region. So in his mind, his discovery was as good as gold. So he raises money, builds a road, and then diverts travel to the road. He led the first wagon train through what's today known as Beckwourth Pass. That party climbed to an elevation of 5,221 feet, which was the lowest route through the Sierra Nevada mountains of the day. Has anyone ever been to Beckwourth Pass? Well, you can go, you can pull over to the side of the road, and there's this great marker, but very not well known. And then you can also go on the trail through the desert if you are so inclined. So for the next 8 years, Beckwourth lives in California near this pass. He welcomes immigrants into the state. He's got this inn, and he also published his autobiography, which you can read today. He died in 1866 in Colorado, back among the Crow people. Multiple newspapers reported his passing, and one of them wrote the following lines. There are few men in the world who have passed through a more exciting or eventful history than he, and there are but few men who had a bigger heart than he. So he's so well known in his day, but why do you think it is that most people, most Americans today, have never heard of Beckwourth? Why was his story largely forgotten over time?
He was an innkeeper.
He was an innkeeper, but he had many, many other jobs besides that.
He was African American.
Yeah, I think for him it mostly has to do with his race. African Americans faced a tremendous amount of discrimination in America during this period. Slavery was legal, until 1 year before he died. So you have people like Kit Carson, Jim Bowie, Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone, who are really well known. But if you check out Jim Beckwourth's autobiography, you'll see that his life was just as exciting, if not more so, and full of adventure. So that is Jim Beckwourth's story. Next explorer I'd like to talk about is Florence Merriam Bailey. By show of hands, has anyone heard of her? Okay, 2, great, good. All right, that's why we're calling them forgotten. So I'm going to call her Miriam during this talk because most of this occurred before she was married and took on her new name. So Miriam was born in Locust Grove, not Long Island, but upstate New York in 1863 near the Adirondack Mountains, and she grew up during the Gilded Age, which was the mid to late 19th century. Now, this was a time when women's fashion dictated the use of feathers in hats and even dresses. These trends came not only from urban Americans' growing interest in recreational activities like hunting, hiking, and fishing, but also from the cultural influence of realism and naturalism in art and literature. So here's some visual evidence of the popularity of feathers. As everyone know, this Easter parade, it still happens today, right, on Fifth Avenue, but you can see the amount of feathers in the hats of the different women, a testament to the popularity of birds during that time. This is a hat that was actually worn by Mrs. Henry Clay Frick from the 1890s. It contains, I think it's the entire body of a crow. Charming, yes. Yes. So demand for dead birds in the name of fashion rose dramatically in the 1870s and 80s when Florence was growing up. People estimate that hunters slaughtered 5 million birds annually and sold those birds to hat makers, dressmakers, and their customers. So this is a really compelling image from a satirical magazine called Puck Magazine. And I don't know if you can read the title, but it's The Woman Behind the Gun. So she's not really, women aren't really out there doing the hunting themselves, but they're, the demand through fashion is what's fueling these suppliers to go out and hunt rare birds and what are becoming rare birds because of slaughter. So that is what this illustration is showing. So despite the fact that this is happening, popular awareness of the crisis is really limited. And there was a really interesting study done right here in New York City. There was an ornithologist named Frank Chapman, and he goes down to Union Square, which was, the height of fashion at the time, the fashion district, and he takes his notebook and he counts the number and types of birds in the hats of women as they walk by. And he records that all. So again, this is like published material you can find today. But over the course of 2 afternoons, he observed 40 different species of birds on the heads of women, ranging from robins and bluebirds to grouse and woodpeckers. So what were people like Miriam going to do? So Miriam wants to solve the ecological crisis, but how do you go about doing that? Well, first what she does is she matriculates at Smith College. Any Smith College graduates tonight here? Nope. So she organized one of the first local Audubon Club chapters, and she teaches the 300 undergraduate women about why birds are so special. The club's meeting was so successful. The first day that this milliner calls and says, did the college ban the use of birds in hats? Because so many ladies came down to the shop and asked for them to take the birds off the hats. After graduating from Smith, Florence Bailey moved right here to New York City, but the crisis still troubles her. So she makes it her mission to save birds through exploration. Her strategy was really unique. She traveled to different regions in the United States, like New Mexico, as you can see here in this rare photo of her in the field, California, Utah, New Mexico. And she basically writes about the anthropomorphic traits of birds for a popular audience. So she's trying to change people's mentalities about birds and why they're not just something that you should wear, but they're actually these, sentient creatures. So that was one approach of hers. And I think that her story is really important in the history of exploration because it marks this shift from some of the primary goals of exploration being the acquisition of resources or land in, Beckwourth's era, the homesteading era, et cetera, to conservation. She's a peer of John Muir's, who's also has a chapter in the book. So you see one of the goals of exploration becoming conservation. And I would say that that is one of the foremost goals of exploration and some of your work here today. One last photo of Bailey. Political action was also necessary. So the last thing that she did was not only exploring and then writing about all the birds, but she also helped Congress pass the Lacey Act, which safeguards birds, passed in 1900 through legal texts that penalized those who sought to illegally acquire, transport, or sell protected species. So why do we think that her story was forgotten over time?
She was a woman and she was talking about birds that women wore. Women don't count.
Yeah, so in her day, it was really unusual to do what she was doing. Women didn't go off and explore, right? They got married and they had children and they stayed at home. And so she really, pushed the boundaries for her of her own time. And she also didn't write about herself. She's writing about birds, so she doesn't leave, a detailed autobiography that someone would then go on and know about today. How many people here know about the third explorer, Harriet Chalmers Adams? Great. Great. Okay, so we've got 2. Both women. All right, so she's great. You're going to love her. Adams was born in Stockton, California in 1875. She had a very active childhood, swimming. She horseback rode with her dad throughout the state. She was really interested in California's history being colonized by Spain, and she made it her life's mission to go and explore every country that had once been colonized by Spain, and there are actually a lot of those countries. Yeah. So in 1899, she married a local man. His name was Franklin Adams, and his job was as a surveyor of mines in Central and South America. Why was he doing that? This was right after the Spanish-American War. So South America was, a region of great interest to American companies. It's the era of industrialization. So they want these raw materials, including heavy metals, and they're going to refine those and produce them. So Frank, her husband, is sent to South America, and she goes along with him and says, like, this is my chance to go do some exploring. So the chapter about Harriet in the book focuses on her greatest journey, in my opinion, which is this 2-year trip, and she visits every single country. She travels through every single country in South America during that trip, which is taken between 1904 and 1906. She was really ahead of her time because she harbored a deep respect for the indigenous people that she met. She was an early ethnographer who recorded her observations and photographed elements of indigenous cultures. One of the places she went was La Paz, Bolivia. This is a city that was first inhabited by Bolivia's indigenous Aymara people, but it was colonized in the mid-16th century by Spanish settlers looking for silver. Under Spanish rule, the Aymara suffered greatly from these, systems of oppression and fraud and forced labor. And in her writing, Adams recognizes this oppression, and she writes about it. She's going to become a contributor to National Geographic, which is important. And you can see some of her, respectful photographs of the Aymara people here. She also traveled to Peru, to the Andes Mountains. She spends a good deal of time in the wilderness there. She encounters wildlife. Her husband was attacked by vampire bats. Lots of exciting things happened. She visited Sacsayhuaman, pictured here. And I think one of her greatest accomplishments during this trip was the fact that she ascended this dormant volcano, El Misti. It's in southern Peru. It's 19,200 feet in elevation, and that elevation was only 2,000 feet lower than the greatest height reached by a climber at the time that she was alive. So she's not, and she's probably, that climber was probably a man. So it's probably, the highest height reached by a woman in her day. After she returned in 1906, that's when she begins working for National Geographic as one of its first female contributors. She also illustrates her articles with her own photographs. If you have a subscription to the Nat Geo archive, you can see them online. They're marvelous. And she was excluded from many different explorers clubs that provided both comradeship and financial support. So she decided to help form her own. Who knows about the Society of Women Geographers? Great. Yeah, awesome. Any members here? Yes, one in the front. I love it. Great. Bravo. It's a really important organization, and they're coming up on their 100th anniversary next year, based in Washington, D.C. She's
Formally started in New York City.
Thank you. I didn't know that. And Adams served as its first president. So that's actually her here. And she's giving the club's first gold medal award to another explorer featured in the book and another important woman, Amelia Earhart, for her solo transatlantic flight. And other members of that organization included Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Amelia Earhart, yes. So why was she not remembered? She never published about herself. The only way that I was able to get at her story was through the generosity of a fellow scholar who shared her transcriptions of her private unpublished journals from 1904 to 1906. So she's an important woman, and that's one reason why she's been forgotten. She never wrote about herself publicly. All right, we've got one more explorer tonight, and I think that this explorer is probably the most well-known. So how many people here know Matthew Henson? Okay, great. Maybe half the room. So maybe there'll be maybe there's a little more info in here that is new to you. But Henson was born in Maryland in 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended. His parents were sharecroppers, but they died when he was 7, leaving him orphaned. He moved to Washington, D.C., but he ran away from home then at the age of 11 to Baltimore. He becomes a cabin boy on a merchant vessel bound for Hong Kong. And this is what he says about that trip. After my first voyage, I became an able-bodied seaman and for 4 years followed the sea in that capacity, sailing to China, Japan, Manila, North Africa, Spain, France, and through the Black Sea to southern Russia. So he went all over the world, before he was even grown. And I would argue that these trips prepared him then for those journeys to the Arctic, 7 journeys with Robert Peary, who was, as you know, probably a Navy officer and the leader of their ultimately successful trip to the North Pole. Are there any Arctic explorers here tonight?
Raise your hand, Brittany.
Awesome. Great. Would love to hear more about your adventures after. So at the age of 19, Henson teamed up with Peary, first serving as his aide on, and they begin the first of these 7 expeditions. And what's happening? Why are they going to the Arctic? People at this time, this is, the late 19th, early 20th century, people didn't even know if there was land or if it was sea up at the top of the world. And then people were racing, different people from different countries, from Norway, et cetera, are trying to be the first to reach the North Pole. There's this imperialist impulse sweeping the world. So while he was exploring, Henson became hardened by the frigid climate, and he also adopted new ways of living. He learned from the members of the Inuit community, an indigenous group of people who had lived in the Arctic for hundreds of years, and they taught Henson how to endure the extreme weather, how to hunt, how to forage for food, how to build sledges, and he also becomes fluent in the Inuit language, something Robert Peary never did. So he was a really critical person on these expeditions to the North Pole. Just checking the time here. So obviously the thing he's most well known for is this trip to the North Pole from 1908 to 1909. The SS Roosevelt, you can see this is a diagram from Bowdoin College. Right at the bottom, you can see New York. He leaves right here from the city, and then they go all the way up to the very top to Cape Sheridan. That's where they spend the winter of 1908. And then in February of 1909, they leave the boat and they go up to, you see the last point of land is Cape Columbia, and then a small group then pushes off to cross 413 nautical miles to reach the North Pole. So it was Henson, Peary, Unigwa, Uquayug, Siglu, and Utah, and I'll show you pictures of them. So 4 Inuit men, and they're split into 2 teams, with Henson leading one team and Peary leading the other. And a plug for the Explorers Club, of course. They have a marvelous, marvelous archival collection, and these images here are from the Peary Arctic Club's files right here at the Explorers Club. So it takes them about a month, a grueling period during which Henson said his mind was on, quote, on the going and getting forward and on nothing else. And they finally, after many travails, reached the North Pole. So here's Henson in the middle, and then you can see the 4 Inuit men surrounding him, and Robert Peary took this photograph. Here's what Henson said about this moment. He said, when Peary raised the American flag, Henson, quote, felt a thrill of patriotism, and he raised his voice to cheer the starry emblem of his native land. He viewed the discovery as what he called almost the last of the world's great work, taking his place in history as the first black explorer to stand at the top of the world. But as an African-American man returning to the United States during the Jim Crow era, he would not receive his due for the critical role he played during the expedition. At home, this is again 1909 now, newspapers that were predominantly targeting white audiences, they overlooked or minimized his contributions. They called him Dave, the cook. It was just completely discounting everything he had done. But if you look at the black newspapers owned by African Americans and with a predominantly black readership, those newspapers are celebrating Henson's success and enumerating the ways in which he helped the expedition's members reach the North Pole. So you've got 2 different narratives that are being put out in Jim Crow America. Only in Henson's later life did he receive fuller recognition for his achievements. The Explorers Club allowed him to join in 1937. You can see some of his artifacts in the lobby here. He's obviously a very important member, celebrated today. And then Congress gave Henson it's called a Peary Polar Expedition Medal in 1944. Henson died in 1955. He was buried here at Woodlawn Cemetery. But then under Ronald Reagan, his remains were reinterred with honors and moved to, so in Arlington Cemetery, right near the grave of Robert Peary. Has anyone seen those two grave sites today? It's really like an amazing thing to see because you can see that, Peary's got this monument to himself with a globe and, crowing about being the first at the pole, and then Henson now next to him, something Peary probably would have been, very envious of, has his own narrative in black stone and a picture of him and the Inuit men. So you've got even, in death, these dueling narratives about exploration and achievement that are visible in that interesting way. So this concludes the presentation for tonight. I'm happy to answer questions about anything. Thank you. So raise your hands if you would like, and I'm happy to call on anyone. Yeah, please.
How did you get interested in this subject?
That's a great question. I think exploration is an evergreen topic. I think there are so many untold stories, and many of these stories are just really rich and complicated stories. I think the history of exploration is one in which, again, from the 10 explorers in this book, like there really are people who've been left out who did important things, and I hope that reading these stories, makes people feel good about the fact that they're now included in this important part of American development and history. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Right here.
So you showed some wonderful photographs. I'm really curious how photographs played into your research for this book, and there's Mike now, and how that really helped you to build these narratives, especially when there was not information there and you had to build upon just a photo.
So kind of as primary sources, you mean historic photographs?
Yeah, historic.
Yeah, I would say, I'm just thinking about the list. Photographs can be really helpful because it enables you to see things close to how people saw them back then. I think the most exciting find doing the research in terms of photographs was actually relating to Harriet Chalmers Adams. I came across this album at UCLA, and it's from 1905 to 1906, and it has all of these, and it's not related to her, like her name isn't on it, but it actually has all of the photos from the places that she went. And so working with another scholar, we figured out that these two men who took the photographs in the album were likely on her trip for portions of it. So all I had were her transcription, the transcriptions of her journal, and then being able to look at this miraculous album enabled me to see, to be able to, you'll see it in the book, write about the places as she saw them. What were people doing in the mines? How did they look? What were their conditions like? So things like that can really open things up as a researcher. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not in charge yet.
Sorry, just FYI, the Deirdre and David Stamm collection of Matthew Henson is on its way to the University of Pennsylvania.
That's very exciting.
And Deirdre Stamm told me that because I remember the Henson offspring coming to the Explorers Club, and it was some years ago, but it seemed everybody was a little awkward, and they didn't know what to do with them. And Deirdre says that when they flew them in, the Henson offspring and the Peary offspring, from different wives, but from the same community, the Peary family refused to acknowledge them.
So I don't know, all the context, but Peary and Henson both had relations with Inuit women, and so I believe you're referring to their grandchildren. I think is it the grandchildren or the sons? And they came here in the 1980s to America. And so that's an interesting story for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Right here. I loved the selections you made. I'm wondering how much you went through other possibilities and what made you choose these particular ones over others, or these are the obvious ones all along?
That's a great question. There were a couple people that got swapped out and didn't make the cut, but I had 10 chapters, and I wanted to pick someone whose life was largely unknown, or for some of the people in the book, maybe we didn't think of them as explorers necessarily. So kind of reframing their lives in a new way. And then each person, again, I wanted their life to represent more broadly that era in American history. And so those were kind of the things I had in mind when I was making the list. Thank you.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm very curious about Miriam, especially in the pushback she may have got. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. The pushback she may have gotten from the media in her conservation efforts about saving the birds. Were you able to research any of those topics?
Yes, I mean, many women weren't even writing in her day. She was part of a tiny fraction of women that even went to college. So she was just at the forefront of not only conservation, but also just being a scholar and especially going off and exploring. I would say that thinking about how her books were received, some people I think didn't appreciate the amount of exploration that went behind writing them and thought, oh, these are books for, women and children because they're not written in a high academic style. But that was her intention, was to write it in that style to change people's minds and then have a change in people's behavior. So that was part of her strategy. Thanks.
So writing a book is such an intensive and sometimes heartbreaking process, especially once it becomes time to edit and deal with outside input. I'm really curious, because I've been through this. What are the stories or the people that it absolutely killed you to have to leave on the cutting room floor? Because I know there must have been some good ones.
That's a good question, and I'd like to give a shout out to my editor, Nick Amplet, who's amazing and who's here tonight. Thanks, Nick, for being awesome. No, but I don't think, I think that maybe some of the stories that I'm heartbroken to have left out are the stories that I don't yet know. For instance, when I was researching this book, it was during the pandemic, and I couldn't even physically come. The club was closed and the archives were closed, so I had to sort of know what I was asking for before I got it. But I think if you went upstairs to the archive and looked at all of their treasures, you would just come across amazing stories that still haven't been told. So there's lots of room for many more books to be published on these unknown explorers.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm wondering what your takeaway lessons are from, patterns that you observe from these stories or things like that that might relate to how people go about modern expeditions. Should they do more PR? Should they talk about themselves? Should they, what are those things for you as you look through these stories?
Great question. That's one of my favorite types of questions because I love thinking about kind of the patterns across the different stories. And I think two of the kind of themes that came to mind when thinking about that question would be the traits. What traits did these 10 explorers have in common? What does it take to succeed as an explorer? So, I think some of the obvious ones are curiosity, determination, but I think Ted alluded to something in his introductory remarks about the ability to work well as a team. You see 10 faces, but as Ted said, there are all of these people that are supporting these expeditions. I think one really surprising commonality about these explorers was they have got a high tolerance for risk, and I have a hypothesis that having really troubled and broken childhoods or marriages led them to go off because maybe they had a little less to lose. So there's a lot of that in terms of commonality. And then about publicity and connecting it to today, I think one thing that you see in the past is this question of what expeditions get funded. And I know that's probably a big concern today as well, right? Who gets the money to go off? It's expensive. Is it government funded? Is it private money? How is it allocated? Is it fair? So I think these questions, plagued people back then, and I imagine that they're still at the forefront of people's minds today.
So I was kind of wondering, what's a favorite book you read on like history or exploration that kind of inspired you to go down this route and write something like this?
Good question. I am a fan of Hampton Sides. I just did an event with him, and you should check out his book, The Wide, Wide Sea. He's a great writer. But in terms of primary sources, I would highly recommend that everyone read the journals of Lewis and Clark. Has anyone read those? They were an annotated version before. Okay, great. So that's something to check out. And why are they so amazing? Because this is a record of what people saw as they're going across the continent for the first time. Like, for them, it was truly a journey of discovery. And of course, you know, indigenous people were living all across America, and that comes out so clearly in the journals. So you have written descriptions of what all the different indigenous peoples were like in different parts of the country, and what were their interactions like, and exchanges, and they're just such rich documents that if you really like early American history, that's something to check out.
Thank you so much. I think we all really enjoyed it. I was just wondering if I sense an explorer in you, and I was wondering if you could explore, do you know what you would, where you would go, or what you would look into, or are there so many things that it's hard to narrow it?
No, that's a great question. I have 3 small children, so I think this is the phase of life I'm in where I'm living vicariously through others. Many of you understand that. But I think the Arctic would be a really neat place to explore. The chapter about Matthew Henson is my favorite, and you know, he's written about it so vividly. So I've never been to the far north, and I think it would be a wonderful experience someday. Thanks.
Any last question before we wrap up? So, I'm going this Friday. My daughter checked out a flag, and a bunch of us are going to dive into Chesapeake. There's a 1955 expedition that with some people who went down in this crazy contraption, spent 100 hours on the bottom. We're going to go down there and see what changed.
Great.
Not as exotic as the Arctic.
It's great.
So I'd just like to say, oh, yeah, JR, please. Hang on one second.
Hi, everybody. I just want to mention the Explorers Club's Society of Forgotten Explorers and say a little bit more about it, because it's something that you may be interested in. My name's J.R. Harris, again. I'm a member of the club for 31 years. I'm on the board of directors, and I'm also chair of the club's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. One of the things our committee established is a Society of Forgotten Explorers to recognize people just like the ones that are in Dr. Bellows' book, who never got the recognition and credit that they deserved. The Explorers Club doesn't have any provision for posthumously awarding membership to anybody. So what we did was we established this society to recognize them. Now, anybody who is interested in history, or who is interested in exploration, who's interested in explorers that didn't get the credit that they deserved, you can go on the website. It's not up just yet, but it'll be up pretty soon. And you can read more about people like the ones that are here in the book here. Also, if you have anybody or know of anybody who you believe should be in the society, you don't have to be a member. All you have to do is go on the website, fill out the form, and we will put that person in the Society of Forgotten Explorers. The society right now only has 4 members. Those are the 4 Inuit that accompanied Peary and Henson to the North Pole in 1909. And incidentally, that's the sledge that they went on. So we're putting the final touches on it. Check the website periodically in the next week or 2. And if you, again, are interested in some of these explorers, or if you are a historian and you know about some of these people and you'd like to add information to the explorers that are already on there, you can do that as well. So I just wanted to mention that. And by the way, let's give another round of applause here.
And if I could add one more first to the category, Fania Rose was our first woman president of the Explorers Club, an incredible explorer. A continuing source of wisdom and guidance to us all. So I've been to a lot of lectures over the years at the Explorers Club, and I actually think that from the very beginning of this talk, it was the most engaged I think I've ever seen. You opened it brilliantly by bringing people right in. I was in the back so I could watch the quizzing going on, but throughout I could just see everyone was rapt in their attention, a lot of it because of the incredible originality of what you're doing, but also the deep meaning of it, and of course your sensational delivery. And even during the Q&A, I couldn't spot a single person doing Wordle. It was pretty remarkable. So it's a credit really to you, Amanda, and your work, and it's a credit to you and the audience too, bringing that curiosity here. It's nights like this that get us all energized to be a part of the Explorers Club. A couple of admin things. One is that Amanda's book is out here for sale, and she's, I think, happy to sign and hang around and talk if anybody would like to. And also, a special thing, our bar tonight downstairs, I have to mention this, is open to anybody. Usually it's a little more complicated to go down there, but you're welcome to partake of some of our signature exploration cocktails, such as the Torre Hardal Highball, the Cosmonautopolitan, and my personal favorite, the Shackleton Not Stirred. So, please help us stream up new ones. It's a lot of fun. But I want to end where we began, which, Amanda, what a sensational effort, piece of work. And thank you so much for coming tonight and sharing it with all of us. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And one more round of applause for Amanda. Way to go. Way to go.